Today on this episode of the Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing the startup life cycle, secrets to entrepreneurial success, with master entrepreneur and founder of Boss Capital Partners, Gregory Shepard. Learn about his new book and deep expertise in startup science, rooted in data-driven methodologies and real-world entrepreneurial success, helping a countless number of founders navigate the complexities of launching, scaling, and exiting startups. Much more on this podcast episode. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Greg Shepard. He clearly owns the magic sauce needed for entrepreneurial success. As one of the most experienced and accomplished investors and entrepreneurs in the world, Greg has not only dominated the startup game, but has also devoted much of his career spreading wisdom to prospective proteges. More specifically, his latest book, The Startup Lifecycle, encapsulates years of his research and practical insights, offering a roadmap for entrepreneurs looking to build resilient, high-growth businesses. Greg's credentials speak for themselves. CEO and founder of Boss Capital Partners, a 20-year startup veteran and serial entrepreneur with over 20 liquidity events under his belt, 2 of which were sold as part of a nearly $1 billion transaction and won 4 private equity awards. Oh, and by the way, he is also a Forbes book author and TEDX speaker. But the best part of this interview was actually Greg's candor and willingness to share the reasons for his achievements. His goal is obvious: empower entrepreneurs while increasing startup rates. Moreover, the implications of his concepts are significant, as startups account for a good portion of the U.S. economy, and yet their success remains ever elusive. Listen up as we discuss the startup life cycle, secrets to entrepreneurial success. Check it out. Hey, Greg, how are you?
I'm great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Listen, like we were talking about, we had you on the podcast several years ago to talk about startup companies. And since then, you've published another book. I want to go over it again. And it's such a great topic because, including medicine, a lot of doctors try to be entrepreneurs, start to do startup companies. And it's obviously very challenging. People don't really know the secret to doing startups and having success. And you're a master at it. You've published several books, and look forward to hearing your insight.
Well, thank you for the kind words. I really appreciate that. I'm very humbled.
So, Greg, maybe for our listeners who don't understand the term but use it all the time, what is a startup company? What is the definition?
There's 2 types of startups. There's like what we call lifestyle startups, which is something where you're building the company for yourself and you're not intending on selling it. So you're not raising capital necessarily, or if you are, it's more debt capital or invested for dividend capital. And then there's what's called a growth company. And a growth company is where you're raising substantial amounts of capital from investors with the intention of selling the business, exiting the company.
Now, people listening to this may think, well, we all have great ideas, right? We all go around, we think about what we can improve, whether it's in our work or our daily lives. So many ideas, so few of them become profitable. What exactly makes an idea profitable and worth the investment?
I think that, if you first look at companies, you have let me back up to move forward actually. So there's 2 types of founders. There's visionary founders and there's subject matter expert founders. Subject matter expert founders are like you're a doctor, deep knowledge about what you do. And then there's a visionary who doesn't have the deep knowledge. They're not a subject matter expert, but they're a CEO type that expands a business from the outside. Then if you think about from an investment criteria, you have the horse and the jockey, right? So you have the horse, which is the founder, and you have the jockey, which is the business. And if you have a subject matter expert, they're going to be closer to the horse, maybe not as good of a jockey. But if you have somebody that's a visionary, they're going to be really good at the jockey side and maybe not have the deep knowledge on the horse side, right? So there is a bit of there's a bit of a skill involved in that, right? So you have to really understand the 2 sides of it. A good business is a business that, let me say this first. If the horse is really good, if you have an incredible idea and a really good business, but the founder can't execute on the business, it doesn't matter how big the business, how good the business is. So when you're analyzing investments in businesses, the first thing you do is you look at the CEO or the founder who's going to be heading up the business. Then after that, you look at the business and decide whether that person can execute on this idea, which goes back to whether or not they have subject matter expertise, or if they have a co-founder for subject matter expertise. If you have a co-founder in a founder situation where you have a subject matter expert and a visionary and the idea is good, then your investment is a lot more likely to be successful. Then there's the other two things to consider. So market conditions, right? In companies acquire other companies, and customers buy products for one of two reasons, either to make or save money, full stop. If you're in a bull market, everybody's mindset is make money. If you're in a bear market, everybody's mindset is save money. So the idea and how it's marketed and what's going on in the market also play a role in whether or not it's going to be successful. So I would say that that little bundle of things is going to play a large role in at least your first evaluation of the investment criteria.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly need both aspects, like you said, a great idea and a great plan. But how do you avoid these what are called passion traps that I've been reading about? You've got these investors, especially doctors, who get super into an idea for whatever reason, very passionate about their their particular idea, but maybe it's not fiscally sound. So, what do you recommend when people have this intense idea that they're very much behind, but avoid being so one-sided without looking at the fiscal, financial component?
Biases play a large role in bad investments, especially confirmation bias, right? Where you're sort of convincing yourself over and over that this thing is really good. I think that the best way to do it is to look at it logically from a unit economic perspective, right? So there's two drivers. Well, there's three drivers that create value in a company, what we call valuation drivers. That's growth, margin, and retention, right? So growth of revenue, margin on revenue, and retention of revenue, right? Those are the three core valuation drivers. Then you have your unit economics. The most logical unit economic is your customer acquisition cost to your lifetime value. So, how much did it cost you to get a customer, and how much is that customer going to pay during the whole time that they're a customer of yours? That's their lifetime value. And it equals a ratio, right? So, if you put in $1 and you make three, that's a $3 ratio or 3x ratio. So what you really want is plus three. So three is the minimum. So when you look at a business and you look at the unit economics, you're looking at how much it costs them to acquire a customer and how much the customer is going to pay, and you don't see more than 3x on it, the deal's just not going to make sense. So you have to back in and work on the deal to get that 3x plus out of the deal. So it's that plus the looking at the business instead of looking at the financials, look at what's creating the financials. So a lot of investors, especially angel investors, will look at the profit and loss in the balance sheet, right, and the statement of cash flows, and what they're looking at was created probably around 6 months ago, right? So it's like driving down the freeway looking behind you. What you have to look at is you have to look at what created those numbers. What are what we call the leading indicators that created those numbers? So when you look at growth, margin, and retention, the sales and marketing team would have created the growth numbers. The shared services, which is operations, would have managed to keep the margins in a good place. And the service side of the business would have handled retention. So what you do is you look at how they're generating their numbers and the unit economic of CAC to LTV, and this will give you a forecast of whether or not you should pull the plug or stay with the deal, right? If the numbers don't make sense, listen to the numbers, but not necessarily the financials. What's creating the financials? Does that make sense, or do you want me to dig in
No,
more?
no, no. It makes total sense, and I think that's the important part is that you've got a lot of people who have great ideas. I'm surrounded by physicians that all want to change the field, and I think that's a great attitude to have. But you've got to look at all the components, like you're saying, before you get fully invested, because a great idea doesn't necessarily make a great startup. And I think that is terrific advice. I think also what we see is a lot of short-term success can happen. That is relatively common, but long-term success, which is what you're preaching, is
Mhm.
relatively rare. How do you keep the momentum going after early success in these startup companies?
So, I mean, typically, like in my research on founder failure and success, it's about 47.1% that fail in the first 18 months. The ones that fail for the following 5 years, the research was 5 years, so I only have data on 5 years. But the ones that fell victim to failure over the following 5 years, the majority of those failed for things they did in the first 18 months. So the first 18 months is critical to the long-term success of the company. And so you have these things like overvaluation. So, a founder starts out and they go, oh, my company's worth X. And then over time, they realize that there isn't enough money in the deal for investors. And then they fail because they've overvalued their company. They think that they have like a $5 million pre-money valuation. They raise $1 million. Now they have a $6 million post-money valuation, and it's early. But the investors are actually looking for 3 to 10 times that. So the founder is sitting there going, oh, really, to make my investors happy, maybe I need to sell for 10. The investors are thinking, oh, maybe they're going to sell for 60, 50 or 60, right? So what happens then is when you start to raise money later on, you can't raise money because the deal's overvalued. So this is one of the really big reasons, because there's just not enough money in an investor, right? Investors looking at your deal, they're looking at another deal, which one has the biggest spread in terms of the arbitrage, and that's the direction they're going to go. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when you go from your vision stage, your ideation, where I have an idea and you're refining those things, into product, where you create first a prototype. It can be made out of clay. It's not a big deal, right? And then you go to your pilot, and then you go to your minimal viable product, and then from there you go into your go to market. This is where everybody fails. What they do is they go from go to market directly into growth. And the problem with that is that any problems that you have, which you will have a lot at that stage, they grow with you. So a lot of the businesses in the following 5 years are failing because those problems carried with them, and they inflated as they grew. They got bigger, right? And now they start to cost money, and they don't realize they're even a problem until it's too late. So what I recommend in the book, in the startup lifecycle, is that you go from go to market into standardization first. Standardization is where you look at how your business is run, how everything is run, put KPIs in place, and really focus on understanding how your business works. Then you go into optimization, where you stand on the heels of what you did during standardization and you optimize everything. And then you go into growth. Those two stages in the center prevent you from failing in the future, because you've caught everything and optimized it, meaning fixed it, right, before you went into it. So a large majority of founders fail because they don't go through those stages. So they're blind to the problems they have. And then boom, right? And the standardization, you're a doctor, right? So you're diagnosing your company, right? And then optimization is making it healthy, and making it healthy before you grow, before you go into the growth stage.
Now you talk about your book, which is a bestseller. It's the startup life cycle. What was your impetus to write this book?
It had a lot to do with, I mean, I spent a little time in politics trying to move money down to startups, and I got turned down uh, a few times. And then what I did is I said, why are you guys turning this down? And they said, well, the failure rate's too high. We make the investment we can make. We don't feel safe in doing larger investments because too many of these people are failing. So I then went and did a research project for 5 years on why, when, and how founders were failing, and brought it to them, and they still turned it down. So I was like, I'm going to take all this and write a book and see if I can help founders that way. So the book is the result of 5 years of research and then 4 years writing the book. because it took a really long time to parse the research. I did thousands of interviews that were transcribed, and this is before AI was so useful. And I had to search through these things manually and pull out sentiment and then write about each one of those cases and then back that into the startup lifecycle. So my focus was trying to help founders and for real, like give them the actual truth instead of a lot of hype, right? So, make it so that when somebody read the book, it's actually helpful at the end instead of like, oh, that was fascinating. If you read like a Malcolm Gladwell book, yeah, they're incredibly entertaining. I love them, right? I mean, they're amazing books, but it's not like you get off the book and you're like, oh, I know what to do now, you know?
It's true. No, I mean, your book is very, very practical, which is what I think people want to read. You know, one of the biggest questions is always about funding, right? So let's say one of our listeners has an idea, wants to get started. What is the first step in identifying funding, right? Because you might be super passionate about your idea and you may believe that this is going to change the field or whatever it is that you're applying it to. But how do you convince investors that this is a good idea and get that initial funding that's so critical?
So there's three core things that I tell founders that you really need to you really need to nail down in your pitch deck and in your conversation. It's really just these three things. First is why this, meaning why is this business a good business for me to invest in, right? So this includes who are they going to sell it to? How much are they thinking they're going to sell it to? Keep those numbers pretty conservative, but make sure you have the acquisition, what we call the ideal acquirer profile in place. So why this? And then why now? Meaning, why is now the right time to do this? Is there a tailwind that's happening right now that's pushing you along? Are there headwinds? Why is now the right time? And then the third one is why me? Why am I the right person to do this? So why this? Why now? Why me? Those are the critical things. There's a lot of fluff in between, et cetera, et cetera. But that's really what they want to know.
And I think those are critical, right? Because, like you said, people focus on the fluff, but if you can hit all three of those, it's going to be a lot easier to convince people that this company is worth investing in. And one of the most important things you said is why me? And I want to focus on that because startup companies obviously require leadership. Um, what does leadership mean to you, particularly as it relates to startup companies?
In an early stage startup, so this is pre-A round, it's really important that you can either do the work yourself or you have somebody that can. So you need to be able to do all four functional areas. You need to be able to play and set up your CRM. You need to be able to manage leads, do the marketing. You need to be able to do everything. If you go out and you raise money and then you hire all these people to do these things, you're going to run out of money before you have any revenue, and your investors are going to frown, and you'll be lucky to get a follow-on investment. But if you go out there and you do everything yourself and you really learn these things and do all these little functional area jobs yourself, first of all, when your company grows, you're going to know how these things operate, right? Which is really, really important. You need to understand the details of how these things operate, because there's a chance that, this thing is going to grow and you're going to have people underneath you and you won't know what they're doing. How are you supposed to manage them if you don't know what they're doing? The second reason is that it proves to people, that it proves to the investors that you are capable of picking up the ball when it drops.
But what about communication? You know, we're talking about things that make great leaders, and one of the things that you emphasize is communication.
Hmm.
How important is open communication from the founder throughout the company in order to ensure success?
Honesty is incredible, right? Like, don't, we call it success theater. Don't do success theater. Don't play success theater where you're hyping everybody up with things that you hope are going to be true but aren't necessarily true, right? Keep everything honest and truthful, and tell them the status of things and where they actually are at that point. That's one thing. The other thing is that understanding how to delegate to people is critical. So I use a thing called a RACI, which is responsible. So who's responsible to get it done? Accountable, who's ultimately accountable to make sure it gets done? Consulted, who needs to be consulted in this situation, and informed. And that's what a RACI is. So this, in when I interviewed the Navy SEALs, one of the things I learned is that they have these things called firing lines. In business, we call them swim lanes, right? Which is essentially broken down in a RACI. So whenever you're working through your business, you do a RACI to make sure everybody's aligned and nobody's, running into each other or saying, I thought you were supposed to do that. Or so good leadership, delegation is key to good leadership. Prioritization is also really, really key. So I use a combination of the Eisenhower matrix, which is urgent versus important. If urgent things are happening, you're ignoring the important things. And then I also use effort and impact. So, what has the lowest effort with the highest impact? So, then you have delegation and you have prioritization. Those are two tools I use for those things.
So critical. I mean, I think that people use the word leadership and they don't realize exactly what goes into it. And I think you summarized great leaders know how to delegate. You got to know who you're working with. You got to know your employees. You got to know what they can do and do well. And I think that's a critical part of being a leader. The other thing that your book really focuses on is how fluid and how dynamic a startup company is over the first several years, and
Mm-hmm.
discuss how important market research is, strategizing, constantly forming partnerships, analyzing opportunities, and really tracking sales religiously. I think that it's not just, oh, there's a great idea and run with it, but this is, you are putting in the work day in, day out throughout the first several years and constantly tracking the market.
So the one part of it is that when you're working with a team, it's really important that you say in the beginning is what's important to you is what they get done. But after the company starts to build a team, what's important to you is what they get done, not what they get done, right? What their team gets done. So that's one thing is there's a transition point there, right? Some people can't transition. Some people can't let go of the details. And some people don't want to work on the details and they want to hire people straight away. So making sure that you have somebody that can do the work and then transition into making sure the work gets done with other people is critical, right? That's like a really big thing. I think that the other thing is when you're building a team, you have to make sure that they understand those valuation drivers that I was talking about earlier. So, you know, growth, margin, and retention. So, growth is sales and marketing. So, let's zero in on that to surround your question. When you start out, you have an audience. This is all the people that you think could buy your company, or sorry, buy your product. And then that audience gets shaped down to what's called a market qualified lead. A market qualified lead is somebody that is now in your SOM. They're somebody that you think you would buy your product and you think you could sell it to them, right? So it's a market qualified lead. They also have somehow reacted to some form of content. So you may have posted a blog post, you may have put out a guide or something like this, and they click on it, and your software says, "Oh, somebody clicked on it." Right? The software, most CRM sales software has this, where they do what's called scoring. So if somebody clicks on a piece of content, that's 1 point. If they download something, maybe 2 points. They get to 10 points, and then they drop from a market qualified lead to a sales qualified lead. Now, why is this so important? Because before we would do cold calls. Remember telemarketing? This is where people would just call and call and call. And you're trying to hit them at the right time. You don't know if you're talking to the right person. They don't have the right time. It's a hit and miss game. It's a nightmare. Well, we moved to this CRM software that actually does it digitally, and it drops into a sales qualified lead when the sales rep knows that now they actually want to talk. So you don't have so many missed blanks when you're sitting out there selling. So you have this sales qualified lead. So what you see is like a waterfall, right? You have a pond at the top, that's your audience, rolls down into a market qualified lead, goes from there into a sales qualified lead, and then it goes into the pipeline. Now, once it hits the pipeline, you have a scoring system there too. So now it's a sales qualified lead, and you have to figure out probability and predictability. Like in any business, whether you're selling the business, somebody's investing into the business, you're doing sales and marketing, every scenario, it always backs down to probability and predictability. How probable is this outcome? And is it predictable? Meaning, when do I think it can happen? And how much is it worth? Right. So, when you get into that, the software will do what's called a weighted value, and that's called a weighted pipeline. So, let's say that you have a prospect in your pipeline, and the status of this prospect is demo booked, right? Well, your value for that may be 10% probability. If the deal's worth $1,000, then 10% of that is the weighted average. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Now, so now let's say you have this next booking, and this booking is discovery complete. Well, maybe that's a 20% probability. The next one is demo complete, you proposal sent or something like that, right? Maybe that's a 40% probability. So it takes the entire pipeline and it takes all these weighted averages and it gives you a weighted average for the whole pipeline based on the probabilities. So what you have to do is you have to be really honest about the probabilities percentage that you put in there. Otherwise, you're lying to your own self. But this is a strategy that really works for sales. That entire piece, that is actually how sales really get done. Is that process?
I think that the take home point from what you're saying is that the companies that do well have leaders and leadership committees that are flexible. You're constantly, adapting. It's a very dynamic process. And I think in order to ensure long-term success, you have to be able to adapt and move quickly and be fluid. And I think that's a great point of your book. I want to go back to leadership and visionaries. And I see behind you, you have a picture of Steve Jobs, and obviously he's one of the biggest visionaries of all time, and people like Jeff Bezos. What makes these people special, and how can we learn from their success? I mean, Steve Jobs in particular, and Apple is still doing it. It seems like Apple has just completely dominated the market, and every time they have an idea, it's a game-changing idea. And like, how are they constantly pushing the limits, and how is every decision they make such a winner?
They do a huge amount of market research. So, like I'll give you an example. At Startup Science, my company, right? My 13th startup is crazy, huh? Anyway, at Startup Science, what I do is I will send surveys to customers and I will ask them a series of different questions to understand their interest. When you have a startup company without any customers, you put together an advisory board. And that advisory board includes an industry advisor. So this is your subject matter expert that's in the space, that really knows the space. You have a acquisition advisor. This is somebody that would be a good acquirer for your business. That's somebody else that you have. And then you have a customer advisor. And this is somebody that represents the voice of the customer. You can have up to 5 of each of those. 10 is a little much, but you can have 5 of those. And you ask all 3 of them the question. You can add on an investor as another advisor. And what you're doing is you're asking them the questions about your idea and what they think of your idea moving forward. And you're going to get 4 different lenses. You're going to get an investor lens on how investable it is. You're going to get a customer lens on whether or not they need it, they want it, or it's a pain point, right? Because there's vitamins and then there's medication. you know, if it's a vitamin, it's a take it or leave it. If it's a medication, it means it's necessary. So if people are saying, yeah, this is a pain point, I need to have this, you got something good. If somebody says, I think it would be nice, then you probably don't have anything good, right? Steve Jobs was notorious for saying people don't know what they want until you show it to them. What he meant, misunderstand what he was talking about. You have to read the whole transcript to understand what he was actually talking about. I'll give you an example. You look at virtual reality, and Facebook came out with virtual reality goggles, and all these people came out with virtual reality goggles, and Apple came out with something that is completely next level. I don't know if you've ever tried them, but it is absolutely insane. It's
No, what is it?
craziest. Oh, There are these virtual reality goggles that you put on. You can see through them, so you can walk around with them on. Yet everything on your phone or your computer is in the goggles in a 360-degree view. You can have desktops, you have a keyboard, you have your icons, you can click things by pressing in the air, you can type just by, typing in the air while you're looking around. So you could be walking around,
Wow.
open up a GPS and follow the GPS virtual reality. So it's augmented, right? So you can still see what's behind you. You can watch a movie in this thing that is 360. You can look behind you, you can look up, look down. The movie's everywhere. The sound is really incredible. So, and it looks cool and it's comfortable, which is, you don't see that with the other ones. So they do a really good job on understanding the customer and what the customer really wants. Instead of just saying customers want virtual reality goggles, which is what Facebook did, Apple said, what type of virtual reality? Do they want virtual or do they want augmented? Does it need to look good? It needs to be comfortable. It needs to be cool. You would be surprised how much time they spend putting fake phones in the hands of people to see what sort of hand sizes work with specific phones, right? So if it's a smaller hand, they have a smaller phone for you. If it's a bigger hand, you have a bigger phone for you, right? Because you can't reach the. So it's stuff like that little stuff that is big stuff that makes a big difference between what Apple rolls out and everybody else. And they also have they understood and still understand that technology does not have to be ugly, and it can be fashionable. I mean, Apple is like the, Prada or Louis Vuitton or whatever of electronics. And other companies still haven't figured out how to accomplish that.
Yeah, it's incredible. Apple and Amazon never cease to amaze me. Every time you think that they've outdone themselves, they continue to outdo themselves, and it's really amazing leadership. And I think that's an example of it's never good enough, and it's always what the people want. And I think you're right, they do a lot of research, because numerous times you'll be like, oh, I wish they had this, and then the next update comes and it has it. So clearly they know what needs to be taken to the next level. Wrapping up here, because I know you're super busy, but you've been ultra successful in your life. As you said, 13 startups, which is frankly a ridiculous number. Congrats on all of that. What do you attribute your success to? Who was your role model, and what really inspires you on a day-to-day basis to keep doing what you do?
I think that there are 5 things that you need. I call it a handful. So, like five, if each finger represents one of the things: focus, drive, enthusiasm, discipline, and optimism. That's what I think. I think that if you can't focus, you're never going to make it, right? If you're not driven, and drive comes from looking into the future and grasping onto something and letting it pull you forward instead of pushing yourself to it, right? That's drive, meaning your vision and your passion for that. Enthusiasm is contagious, and it doesn't matter what you have to be enthusiastic, right? If you aren't enthusiastic about what you're doing, neither is your team going to be. So you have that focus, drive, enthusiasm, and then you have discipline. And discipline is the thing that you pull out when everything else fails. This is the thing that, when if you're a runner and you just cannot seem to get out of bed at 5 in the morning to go for a run, but then you deploy discipline and you do it, right? Discipline is really, really important. And then optimism, which is the biology of hope. If you don't think something is going to work, you're not going to be driven in the first place. You're not going to be enthusiastic. You're not going to be able to focus. So you have to be optimistic about the outcome. So I think that that handful of things are critical, and I use those things myself. There's 2 types of motivation. There's intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And I think that anybody is motivated on extrinsic motivation, which is money, power, things like that. That's like drinking coffee. As soon as you have it, you want more, you want more, you want more, and it's insatiable. And then the other type of motivation, which is intrinsic, and that's what you get when you're playing Monopoly with your family and you're competitive, or there's a sport that you like to play. I see all the jerseys on your wall, right? So those athletes, right, that are intrinsically motivated to win, right? Michael Jordan, the best athletes in the world are always intrinsically motivated, not money motivated, you know? So, like money, stardom, power, those sort of extrinsic motivations, they die out over time. You get burned out and then they go away, you know? So, I think being intrinsically motivated is another really important thing. And then last, and I know this is going to sound a little new agey, but I meditate like 3 times a day and I visualize 2 tunnels. One tunnel is my forecasted future. And this is what's going to happen if I keep doing what I'm doing. And then I have my manifested future, which is what's going to happen if I change what I'm doing. And I visualize these 2 tunnels and I choose the one I want to go down. At the end of that is light. And when I follow through to that light, I see the world I'm going to have in a year from now, or a month from now, or 5 years from now. And so in that meditation, I always focus on the tunnel of what I want to have happen, not the one of the direction I'm going. And that forces me to make changes.
That's so well said. And I think no matter how much we preach to our listeners or they read your book, many of the things you just mentioned, you're just born with that. Like there is a certain drive and a discipline and a focus. People can work on it, but it, that is just something that you are born with, that innate drive. And like you said, if you're not driven from within, if it's not something that's burning inside of you, you're never going to last. All the external stuff is nice, but it's not, it doesn't have stamina. And I just want to wrap up by saying, congrats on all your accomplishments. The take home point for our listeners is that buy the book, Startup Life Cycle by Greg Shepard. And while startup companies can be daunting, I think we all have ideas and think to ourselves, oh, well, I'll never do a startup company. It is doable. It is feasible. You just got to have the right framework, and your book really summarizes it. So thanks for taking something that has a ton of mystique. And I speak for myself because before we spoke several years ago, I would never even dream of thinking about a startup company because it was so nebulous. But your book and your teachings really make it much more concrete, and it's doable for anyone as long as you follow the right steps.
Thank you. That's so kind of you. I appreciate all the kind words. Thank you so much. It's
Well, it's absolutely true, Greg. You are a master entrepreneur. You do what other people, it's like playing the lotto and someone continues to win the lotto every single month. You wonder how that happens, but you've done it. You've done it amazingly. And again, thanks for sharing all your knowledge, not only on this podcast but in your books.
Thank you. Have a really fantastic day. I really appreciate your time and energy. And this is a great opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you. You too. Bye.